Hey guys, welcome to another night. And trust me, tonight won't be those dry history pages filled with forgettable dates. No, we're stepping into stories that, if Netflix had existed in the Middle Ages, they would have fought to buy the rights. I want you to picture this. The room you're sitting in slowly sinking into darkness. You turn off most of the lights, leaving only a dim glow against the wall. Maybe switch on a small fan to add that soft background hum. Now sit back, because you're about to hear things your history teacher would never dare to tell. Tonight, we'll wander through mouldy castles, where power, desire, and plenty of bad decisions gave Europe some of its most infamous kings. This is where Henry VIII turned love into a battlefield, where Charles VI swore he was made of glass, and where white-cloaked knights fell into the flames but left behind a curse echoing across 7 centuries. And it's not just scandals. We'll pause in Paris, gazing up at the great Notre Dame rising from mud and the calloused hands of thousands of anonymous craftsmen, a hymn in stone, both proud and haunting. So, before we set off on this journey, remember to hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly feel what I bring here is worth it. And more importantly, let me know in the comments. Where are you listening from? And what time is it where you are? I always find it fascinating that in this same night, people from all over the world are gathering together to hear history in such a very different way. Let's step into our first character on this journey, John of England, better known as John Lackland, a name that sounds both funny and brutally accurate. You might remember him through the Magna Carta, the famous charter often seen as the foundation of modern democracy. But trust me, John didn't sign it because he loved freedom or human rights. He signed it because the entire kingdom hated him so much that if he didn't, a massive rebellion would have swept his throne away. Honestly, he was the kind of king who made people invent the concept of limiting royal power just to keep him away from their wives and daughters. John's reign, from 1199 to 1216, was basically a masterclass in how to rule badly. Politically, he lost nearly half of France to others. Financially, he drained his people with all sorts of bizarre taxes. But even those failures were nothing compared to his personal life, which was so scandalous that even medieval chroniclers, who usually turned a blind eye to torture, executions, or witch hunts, still shuddered and left behind sarcastic notes. What made John special was that he didn't just have mistresses, he kidnapped them. He was infamous for abducting the daughters or wives of nobles and locking them away in royal castles, until he either married them off elsewhere or simply left them to be forgotten. If this were a Netflix show, John would have been slapped with an 18+ violence and sensitive content warning within the first 5 seconds. Instead of waging wars to ruin a noble house, John preferred the strategy of seducing or seizing the wife. Then he would humiliate the husband and force him to pay double taxes. A strange political move, but effective. Who needs soldiers when you can just court your enemy's wife? Some chroniclers wrote, "He was not restrained with women, and spared not the wives and daughters of men." That was medieval polite language for saying John turned every Christmas feast into a nightmare. At one point, rumour had it he had as many as 30 officially recorded mistresses. This wasn't romance anymore, it was a staffing problem. And the consequence? Half the nobility trembled every time they heard John was visiting. Not because he brought armies, but because they feared they'd have to lock every door, or their wives and daughters. One baron even swore he would never meet the king unless his entire family and household were locked in a secure room, safe from John's opportunism. That was 13th century diplomacy, nervous smiles, locked doors, and prayers. The biggest issue was that John actually believed he was irresistibly attractive. In his letters, there are hints he thought women adored him. But honestly, there's zero evidence beyond his own delusion. Classic power plus throne equals self-deception. And don't think he stopped at scandalous affairs. John also excelled at making enemies with the Pope. When a dispute broke out over appointing the Archbishop of Canterbury, Pope Innocent III excommunicated him and placed the entire kingdom under interdict. Imagine, for years, no weddings, no funerals, churches shut down. Why? Because John refused to give in. As a result, he became one of the rare kings officially treated as an enemy of the Pope. Militarily, John was no better. In 1214, At the Battle of Bouvines, he suffered a humiliating defeat against the French alliance, losing most of the remaining lands on the continent. From then on, he carried the nickname Lackland, both an insult and a historical fact. But the peak disaster came in 1215, when the barons rebelled and forced him to sign the Magna Carta. Today, it's seen as the cornerstone of Western democracy, but at the time, it was simply a contract to stop John from wrecking the country further. One baron even described it, "We needed a shield against our own king." And thus, Magna Carta was born. In the end, John left England in chaos, seething with resentment, and with one ironic legacy. People had to invent checks on royal power just to deal with him. He wasn't the worst king in all history, but he was definitely the last person you'd ever want to babysit your kids. Maybe, if there's one thing John accidentally gave humanity, it was the motivation to build democracy. Not because he believed in it, but because his subjects and nobles were so fed up they had no other choice. And so, John Lackland became living proof that sometimes it's the very worst rulers who unintentionally create the greatest chapters of history. After parting ways with John Lackland, the king who turned Magna Carta into a tool to restrain himself, we're crossing the English Channel to France, where another king proved to be just as much of a disaster. Meet Charles VI, better known as Charles the Mad. Harsh as it sounds, trust me, he truly earned that name. Charles took the throne in 1380 at just 11 years old, and at first everyone thought this would be a bright reign. He was young, intelligent, handsome, a gallant horseman, and was expected to pull France out of the quagmire of the 100 Years' War. But then, everything collapsed quickly, because this king suffered from a mysterious mental illness, and the whole kingdom had to witness a reality show unlike anything else in European history. Charles began with bouts of memory loss. Suddenly, he didn't recognize his wife, his children, and once even failed to recognize himself. Then he spiraled into paranoia, attacking his closest knights. One day, in the middle of a hunt, he suddenly drew his sword and killed several men in his escort, convinced they were enemies in disguise. So, from a promising young king, Charles became the most dangerous man in the room, even if the room only had him and a mirror. But the mirror wasn't safe either. There was a period when Charles believed he was made of glass. Yes, glass. He insisted on being wrapped in blankets by his servants to avoid cracking, and refused to let anyone touch him for fear of breaking his arms and legs. This was no longer political tragedy, but a dark comedy sketch. The French didn't know whether to laugh or cry when their king held court wrapped up like a doll in quilts. Of course, despite his unstable mind, Charles didn't neglect matters of love. He had one official mistress, Odette de Champdivers, poetically called the King's Comfort. Odette cared for Charles for years, patiently listening to him ramble about being made of glass, even helping him wear layers of padded clothing so he could sit down without shattering. If that wasn't love, it was at least patience worthy of a Guinness record. And what about Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, Charles's lawful wife? She not only had to play single mom to 12 children, but also shouldered the responsibility of running the court as her husband grew worse. While Charles fled from mirrors, Isabeau ran frantically to keep the kingdom afloat. Naturally, the court factions erupted, splitting France apart and pushing the nation into civil war. But the tragicomedy didn't stop there. Picture yourself at a royal banquet, where the king decides to stage entertainment. In 1393, Charles and some close nobles dressed up as wild men in costumes of hemp soaked in flammable resin. The plan was to dance around the hall for amusement. Sounds dangerous already. And, right on cue, a torch accidentally touched one of them. The whole group went up in flames like human fireworks. Charles barely survived, but his reputation never recovered. The event went down in history as the Ball of the Burning Men, and truly, it defined his reign. Still, Charles VI fathered 12 children. Some were conceived during those rare moments of clarity. People joked it was proof he at least remembered his royal duties on a few specific days each year. But in truth, those children grew up in chaos, with a father lost to madness, a mother accused of infidelity, and a country invaded by the English. Ironically, the nickname Charles the Mad became his eternal legacy. He wasn't remembered for policy, nor praised for victories, but immortalized for his glass delusion, the burning costume party, and a fractured court. But if you look closely, the tragedy of Charles VI reflects a bitter truth. When a king holds absolute power but lacks the sanity to wield it, the entire nation pays the price. The French of his time didn't just endure the 100 Years' War. They also suffered from the illness of their king, an illness with no cure, leaving only chaos behind. Charles died in 1422, leaving France divided, much of it under English occupation, and a historical legacy that makes posterity both shake their heads and stay fascinated. It's hard to believe one man could be a king, a mental patient, and a tragicomic figure all in one body. If Charles VI could be summed up in one sentence, maybe this: he was living proof that a throne can turn into a prison, and sometimes the greatest danger to a kingdom is its ruler himself. If you think France with a king who believed he was made of glass was chaotic enough, then get ready. Because now we're heading south to Castile, medieval Spain, where another king decided to turn romance into a deadly weapon. This is Peter I of Castile, a man history remembers with two opposite nicknames. To his supporters, he was Peter the Just, but to his enemies, and trust me, that list was longer than your Facebook friends list, he was Peter the Cruel. Peter reigned from 1350 to 1369. If you had to sum it up, his rule was a mashup of Romeo and Juliet gone dark, mixed with a touch of Game of Thrones, and ending with a bloody round of family therapy. From the start, Peter fell for a noblewoman named Maria de Padilla. They say he loved her so deeply that he may have even secretly married her. The problem was, royal marriages back then weren't about love, they were about politics. And politics arranged for Peter to marry Blanche of Bourbon, a French princess. The wedding was lavish, fireworks lit the sky, the feast overflowed. But after just 3 days, Peter locked Blanche away in a distant castle and left her there for life. All because his heart belonged to Maria. This wasn't ghosting anymore. This was ghosting on a feudal level. Marry your wife, then immediately lock her up. While Blanche lived like a prisoner, Maria became Peter's eternal love. She bore him 4 children, and when she died young, Peter wept so bitterly that he declared Maria had been his rightful lawful wife all along, a late attempt to legitimize everything. But Peter's love life didn't stop there. This man had a dangerous habit. He loved with the same intensity as his cruelty. If a mistress dared to leave him, the outcome was often death. One lover, Doña Juana, tried to escape, and days later her body was found chopped into pieces. And that tragedy wasn't an exception. It was almost Peter's signature romantic style. Don't think he reserved his brutality for women either. Peter was willing to kill anyone he suspected, brothers, cousins, even people who simply looked him in the eye. Chroniclers wrote that Peter often sat on a balcony, embracing his mistress while watching executions below. For him, that was a Sunday afternoon show. If HBO had existed then, they'd have bought the rights instantly. The Castilian court under Peter was nothing less than a whirlwind of gossip, blood, and tears. Some nobles called him a heartless tyrant, while others admired him for his iron hand against rebellious lords. That's why he carried 2 clashing nicknames, El Justiciero, the just, and El Cruel, the cruel. Like a movie review with both 1-star and 5-star ratings on Rotten Tomatoes. In the end, karma came calling. His half-brother, Henry of Trastamara, gathered rebel forces and decided to end this bloody reign. In 1369, during a brutal battle, Peter was captured. And in perhaps the most infamous family therapy session in history, Henry personally killed Peter with a dagger. A king's life ended at the hands of his own brother. Even Shakespeare would have envied this tragedy. So, what legacy did Peter the Cruel leave behind? To his enemies, he was a monster. To some commoners, he was a king who dared to crush corrupt nobles. To history, he stands as proof that love, when mixed with power and obsession, can become a deadly weapon. Our next king, Edward II of England, proves something different. Sometimes, love can drive an entire kingdom insane. Edward II reigned from 1307 to 327, and he's probably most famous for two things. One, his disastrous defeat to the Scots at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. Two, his very public affection for the men closest to him, rather than for his lawful wife. One of those was considered treason. The other was endless gossip fodder at royal banquets. Guess which one made the nobles angrier? His most famous companion, and very likely lover, was Piers Gaveston. They'd known each other since childhood, and when Edward became king, Piers was practically the star of the court. The king showered him with high offices, rich lands, and jewels so extravagant they outshone the queen. At Edward's coronation, Piers even wore an outfit flashier than the crown itself. If you ever wondered what it meant to upstage the queen, this was it. Naturally, the English nobility couldn't stand it. They saw Piers as a social climber who disrupted order. Queen Isabella, daughter of the King of France, was even more outraged. Remember, she brought a massive dowry and political expectations, not to be reduced to a side character in her husband's love story. Several times, the barons forced Edward to exile Piers, and several times Edward pretended to agree, only to sneak Piers back like a teenage couple reuniting after a breakup. Eventually, the nobles lost patience. In 1312, they captured and executed Piers. For Edward, it was like losing his soulmate. He publicly mourned, weeping dramatically like a character in a soap opera. But instead of learning to balance power and love, Edward found a replacement. That replacement was Hugh Despenser the Younger, and if Piers infuriated the nobility, Hugh made things 10 times worse. Hugh wasn't just a royal favourite, he was practically a co-king, grabbing land, enriching himself at the expense of the lords, and turning the court into his personal empire. The nobility seethed, peasants revolted, and England fell into crisis. But Edward defended Hugh to the bitter end, ignoring all advice. Meanwhile, Queen Isabella had had enough. No longer the sidelined wife, she transformed into England's goddess of vengeance. She allied with Roger Mortimer, a sworn enemy of the king, and also her lover. Backed by France, Isabella invaded England in 1326. The people and nobles, fed up with Edward's rule, immediately abandoned him. The tragic downfall came fast. Edward was captured, forced to abdicate, and his son, Edward III, was crowned. Hugh Despenser met a gruesome end, hanged, disemboweled, and quartered. A crystal-clear message: never come between the king, the queen, and the entire kingdom. And Edward II's fate? That's the part that chills posterity. He was imprisoned in Berkeley Castle, and within a year he was dead under murky circumstances. Some accounts claim he was murdered in a horrific way, with a red-hot poker forced into his body. Modern historians debate the truth, but that image burned itself into collective imagination. It turned Edward II into a symbol of tragedy, a king consumed by love and political failure, both literally and figuratively. So, what legacy did Edward II leave? Militarily, he's remembered for his crushing loss to Scotland. Politically, he left England in chaos thanks to his favourites. But on a human level, he's remembered as a king who dared to love in his own way, defying the prejudices of his time, defying the throne, and defying even his own safety. If Henry VIII is famous for the number of wives he had, Edward II is famous for giving his heart to the men he loved. In a feudal world, that was both shocking and made him an easy target. But it's also what makes Edward one of the most complex and tragic figures in English history. Our next king turned, drinking into national policy. Welcome to Bohemia, today's Czech Republic, and meet Wenceslaus IV, a ruler remembered by history with a name you can't mistake, the Perpetual Drunk. Wenceslaus came to the throne in 1378, and at first glance, he had everything. Noble lineage, the son of the legendary Emperor Charles IV, who had transformed Prague into the cultural heart of Europe. But if Charles IV was a builder, Wenceslaus was a destroyer in a haze of booze. They say Wenceslaus spent more time in taverns than in his palace. He loved Czech beer, yes, it was already famous back then, and the drunker he got, the more he showed his leadership. Specifically, he often held councils not in chambers, but in taverns, surrounded by clinking mugs. and the smell of roasted meat. Imagine Parliament meeting in a pub. That's how he ruled. But it didn't stop there. When drunk, Wenceslaus had no problem, stripping naked. There were nights when he sat among crowds, completely unclothed, giving orders as if he were still a solemn emperor. This was politics in its rawest form. Chroniclers politely recorded, "The king had a habit of appearing in a manner not quite suited to ceremony." Translated into modern language, he was drunk and naked. Worse still was his violent temper when drunk. Once, in a fit of rage, Wenceslaus tortured and killed an archbishop right at the dinner table. They say he grabbed the victim, dunked him in wine, then ordered him strangled. And afterward, he continued the feast as if nothing had happened. That wasn't game night. That was a nightmare. It's no surprise the nobility began to fear and despise him. Many times they tried to intervene, but Wenceslaus always returned to his old ways. He even skipped important events. In 1400, the German princes, hoping for a strong Holy Roman Emperor, deposed him for laziness, drunkenness, and incompetence. Probably the bluntest deposition notice in history. But if it were just drinking, Wenceslaus might have been forgotten. What made him infamous was the irony of his reign. While he sat drinking, Bohemia slid into one of the greatest religious upheavals in European history. The reform movement of Jan Hus began under his watch, challenging the Catholic Church and paving the way for the bloody Hussite Wars. Yet instead of addressing the crisis, Wenceslaus kept drinking. When he died in 1419, the people of Bohemia were long disillusioned. His death nearly coincided with the eruption of the Hussite Revolution. Looking back, they realized, while the world was changing, their king was drinking. He's remembered not for victories or architecture, but for taverns. Even today, some Prague tours still tell his drunken tales as highlights. Imagine that. Your name passed down not for palaces, but for being the naked drunk king. Our next king was a true monster of marriage. Meet Henry VIII of England, the man with 6 wives, his own church, and a habit of turning the bedroom into an execution ground. Henry VIII took the throne in 1509, and at first he was praised as the perfect king. Tall, handsome, athletic, charming, and above all, magnetic. People called him the Golden Prince, a nickname that sounded straight out of Marvel. But it didn't take long for that image to be replaced by another Henry, obese, paranoid, and willing to sacrifice anyone, including his wives, to satisfy his ambitions. It all began with Catherine of Aragon, his first wife. That marriage lasted nearly 24 years, longer than all his other marriages combined. Catherine was kind, intelligent, and had even been the widow of Henry's brother. But there was one problem. She failed to produce a male heir. To Henry, that was basically a system error. After years of disappointment, his eyes wandered to another woman, Anne Boleyn, and that's when the historical tragedy began. When the Pope refused to grant him a divorce from Catherine, Henry did something unheard of. He cut ties with the Roman Church and created the Church of England. Imagine that, all just to marry Anne Boleyn. If John Lackland forced people to invent Magna Carta, Henry VIII forced an entire country to invent a new religion. Anne Boleyn wasn't just a mistress. She was sharp, ambitious, and knew how to keep Henry enthralled. But when she also failed to produce a son, instead giving him Elizabeth, later the great Queen Elizabeth I, love turned quickly to hatred. In 1536, Henry accused Anne of adultery and treason. She was beheaded at the Tower of London. Love became tragedy in an instant. Soon after, Henry married Jane Seymour, his third wife. Jane gave birth to Prince Edward, the male heir Henry had long desired. But joy didn't last. Jane died just days after childbirth. Henry truly mourned her, even calling Jane his only true wife. And yet, he still went on to marry 3 more times. His 4th wife, Anne of Cleves, was a political match. But when Henry met her in person, he was horrified, describing her as a Flanders mare. Their marriage lasted 6 months, unconsummated, and ended in divorce. To be fair, Anne got the better deal. She was given lands, titles, and lived comfortably ever after, one of the few women who escaped Henry alive. Next came Catherine Howard, a young and lively girl. Henry, now fat and diseased, saw her as his fountain of youth. But Catherine had affairs, and her fate was the same as Anne Boleyn's, beheaded. Once again, love ended with the blade. His last wife, Catherine Parr, was luckier. She was intelligent, diplomatic, and wise enough to survive Henry's wrath. She even convinced him to reconcile with his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, securing their places in the line of succession. Catherine Parr was the only one who outlived Henry, and no doubt she sighed in relief when his coffin was sealed. Beyond his wives, Henry VIII was notorious for his brutality. He executed thousands, from nobles to clergymen, anyone who dared defy him. Once a young man who played tennis, wrote poetry, and played the flute, Henry ended his life as a grotesque giant, ulcer-ridden, sitting on the throne and handing out death sentences like Halloween candy. He created a new religion, permanently reshaping the map of European faith. He fathered Elizabeth I, one of the greatest queens in history. And he left behind a bloody love story that still horrifies and fascinates. If you think your love life is complicated, just remember, at least you've never had to build an entire church just to get a divorce. Henry VIII did that, and history calls him one of Europe's most infamous kings. Henry VIII of England may be famous for 6 wives and a brand new church, but his rival across the English Channel, Francis I of France, was famous for being too handsome. That's right, history called him Le Roi Chevalier, the Night King, and also Francis the Handsome. But trust me, behind that charming face and dashing figure was a love life as chaotic as any Netflix series. Francis took the throne in 1515, at just 20 years old. Immediately, he proved himself the perfect Renaissance king, a lover of art, obsessed with war, and above all, a man drowning in romance. He was once said to whisper, "A day without women is a day without light." If Henry VIII turned marriage into a political weapon, Francis turned mistresses into an industry. The French court under Francis was nothing less than a giant catwalk. Ladies from all over Europe flocked to glittering banquets, where wine flowed like rivers and music lasted till dawn. And at the centre of it all, Francis, tall, curly-haired, neatly groomed beard, eyes sparkling with 1,000 promises. If Instagram had existed, his account would have had millions of followers just for smirking selfies. But that charm was a double-edged sword. Francis had so many mistresses that historians couldn't keep count. The most famous was the Duchess d'Étampes, a clever woman with huge political sway. She wasn't just his partner in bed, but also a strategic advisor, capable of toppling rivals with a few whispers to the king. Naturally, Queen Claude, Francis's lawful wife, wasn't thrilled. Claude was virtuous, gentle, and bore him 7 children in 10 years. While she was exhausted from endless pregnancies, Francis was busy building a mistress list that could fill a library. If Netflix made a show about her, the title would be The Queen Who Couldn't Catch a Break. Francis's affairs even tangled with diplomacy. During negotiations with Italy, he was rumoured to have seduced a duchess to shift the outcome. Foreign ambassadors wrote home, both impressed and horrified. The French king conquers not only with sword and lance, but also with his eyes and smile. But not everyone was charmed. On a visit to England, Francis tried his usual flirting with Catherine of Aragon, wife of Henry VIII. Catherine, long used to a philandering husband, shut him down instantly. "I am not a woman to be toyed with." That was probably one of the rare times Francis was rejected in public. Yet beyond the scandals, Francis left a major legacy. He was the patron of Leonardo da Vinci, bringing the genius to France. Thanks to Francis, the Mona Lisa hangs in the Louvre today instead of wandering Italy. You could say that while Henry VIII built a church to divorce, Francis built an artistic legacy to seduce the world. Still, his excesses caught up with him. Francis contracted syphilis, the global epidemic of the Renaissance, and his health collapsed. The once handsome king ended up scarred, frail, and worn down by endless wars with the Habsburgs. They say he died with a broken heart, and a mistress list with pages left unwritten. So, what legacy did Francis I leave? On one hand, he was the dazzling king who made France's court the cultural hub of Europe. On the other, he He was the symbol of indulgence, with whirlwind romances that shook politics. If Henry VIII was the king of bloody marriages, Francis I was the king of glances that made all of Europe drop its guard. One ruled with the executioner's axe, the other with a seductive smile, but both made European history anything but boring. In Spain, at the same time, we had another king, Alfonso XI of Castile, who shocked everyone with his blatant openness in love. No hiding, no secrecy. Alfonso simply declared, "The queen is the queen, but the mistress is my heart." Alfonso XI reigned from 1312 to 1350, and throughout his rule, he was proof that a king could be both brilliant on the battlefield and scandalous in the bedroom. Politically, he was praised for fighting the Moors and winning the Battle of Rio Salado in 1340, one of the greatest victories of the Reconquista. But when he returned to his castle, people didn't gossip about his triumphs. They gossiped about his infamous love affair with Leonor de Guzman. Picture this. Alfonso married Maria of Portugal, a prestigious, beautiful princess, daughter of the King of Portugal. The wedding was grand, the alliance strong. It looked like the perfect political union. But only a few months later, Alfonso abandoned the queen. He barely paid attention to Maria, rarely saw her, and instead openly lived with Leonor, a young, alluring, and cunning noble widow. What shocked everyone wasn't that Alfonso had a mistress that was common in medieval courts. The problem was that he openly turned Leonor into the Shadow Queen. She appeared at ceremonies by his side, travelled with him, and even bore him 10 children. 10. Meanwhile, Queen Maria had only one son, Prince Peter, later known as Peter the Cruel, whom we already met. The court atmosphere became like a dark sitcom. Maria lived in loneliness and humiliation, scorned in public. Leonor grew ever more powerful, to the point where nobles bowed to her as if she were the true queen. And Alfonso? He didn't care about the scandal. In his eyes, Leonor was his true partner, while Maria was nothing more than a political contract he was forced to sign. The price of such brazenness was hatred. When Alfonso suddenly died of plague in 1350, the balance shattered. Queen Maria, after years of swallowing her rage, struck back immediately. She had Leonor imprisoned and ordered her executed behind bars. A move both ruthless and deeply personal, it closed the chapter on one of the most scandalous affairs of medieval Europe. People can easily recall the great victory at Rio Salado, where Alfonso crushed the mighty alliance of Moors and North Africans, halting their invasion of the Iberian Peninsula. That was a glorious military achievement, praised by historians. But when his name is mentioned, most common folk remember Leonor, and perhaps that was his true legacy. Alfonso left behind a Castile, where private love and national politics fused together, inseparable. Leonor gave birth to an entire powerful bloodline, the House of Trastamara, which would later seize the throne and change Spain's destiny. Meanwhile, Maria's only son, Peter, grew up in hatred and resentment, becoming the cruel king we already discussed. In other words, Alfonso's choice of love didn't just shake the court of his own time, it planted the seeds for tragedies and power struggles for generations. He didn't leave behind giant monuments or sweeping reforms, but he left a family scar that would never heal. Our next king left behind one of the darkest stains in French royal history. Meet Philip IV, also known as Philip the Fair, and yes, he really was handsome. But remember, beauty doesn't always come with goodness. Philip reigned from 1285 to 1314. People said he was tall, with sharp features and bright eyes, the very image of a knightly king. But don't let the looks fool you. Beneath that exterior was cold calculation, ruthless ambition, and a man willing to do anything to hold on to power. To see it clearly, look at one of the most notorious scandals in European history, the affair of the Tour de Nesle. It played out like a script written for a TV drama. 3 princesses, Philip's daughters-in-law, were accused of affairs with young knights, and the accuser? None other than his own daughter, Isabella, Queen of England, who would later become infamous herself for overthrowing her husband. The scandal exploded like a bomb. Philip, with his handsome face but iron heart, immediately ordered the arrests. Two princesses were sentenced to life imprisonment in brutal conditions. One was locked in a dark cell until her death. Their lovers were tortured, flayed alive, and executed in the most gruesome ways. Suddenly, the French court, once the symbol of royal beauty, became a giant prison consumed by adultery scandals. But the issue wasn't just infidelity. It was Philip's response. He wanted all of Europe to see that even within his own family, no one could undermine royal authority. His beauty came paired with mercilessness, cold, decisive, and unforgiving. Philip was also infamous for another clash, his war with the Knights Templar. He was drowning in debt to them, but instead of paying, he chose to destroy them. In 1307, he ordered the arrest of all Templars in France on Friday the 13th, the origin of that unlucky day. They were accused of heresy, of worshipping Baphomet, and subjected to horrific tortures. In reality, it was all a show so Philip could seize their wealth. Picture a handsome king, sitting on his throne, preaching justice and faith, while secretly burning alive the very warriors who had fought for the Crusades. That was Philip IV, both the cover model of a Renaissance magazine and the villain of a political horror film. His contemporaries remembered him as a king with rare presence, good-looking, dignified, always clad in magnificent robes. But time stripped away the glamour, leaving behind only this memory. He was the king who planted the seeds of disaster for the Capetian dynasty. After Philip's death, his three sons each took the throne in turn. But thanks to the Tour de Nesle scandal and their broken marriages, the royal bloodline was considered tainted. Within one generation, the Capetians collapsed, replaced by the Valois, leading France straight into the 100 Years' War with England. In other words, Philip left a dazzling exterior, but inside, a fractured legacy. He isn't remembered for military victories or grand monuments, but for creating a brand of power so cold it destroyed his own dynasty. Perhaps, if one sentence could sum him up, Philip was handsome, but that beauty was only a mask hiding a heart of stone, leaving history with more darkness than light. If Philip IV of France was the handsome king with a heart of stone, then our next figure, Sigismund, Holy Roman Emperor, was something entirely different, shrewd in politics, indulgent in his personal life. He reigned from 1410 to 1437, and was remembered as the man who could shake hands with the Pope in the morning, then raise a glass with a new mistress by night. Sigismund was the son of Emperor Charles IV, and from childhood he was raised in a multilingual, multicultural environment. He spoke up to 5 languages, a massive advantage in a Europe fractured into countless rivalries. But that diplomatic gift was only half the story. The other half was his infamous appetite for pleasure. One of his nicknames was the Wandering Emperor, because he spent most of his reign travelling across Europe, from Hungary, Bohemia, and Germany to Italy. And everywhere he went, whispers followed of yet another affair. His lovers ranged from noble women to dancers, even street singers. For Sigismund, the throne wasn't just power, it was a ticket to endless parties. Still, don't mistake him for a mere hedonist. Sigismund had his serious moments. He was the man who called the Council of Constance 1414, 1418, a landmark event that ended the nightmare of the 3 popes crisis. At the time, 3 different men simultaneously claimed to be pope, a political and religious disaster. Sigismund, with his diplomacy and authority, managed to force 2 to step down, restoring unity under a single pope. But even at serious moments, he left his personal mark. At one council session, he dressed so extravagantly that even the pope shot him a disapproving glance. A golden embroidered robe, red shoes, a towering fur hat. He looked less like a statesman, and more like he had stepped straight off a fashion runway. As for his love life, the most famous story revolves around his affair with a Hungarian noblewoman. Rumour had it that he promised her father a higher title if she agreed to share a few evenings. For Sigismund, politics and passion often blended together. That's why he was seen both as a master diplomat and a shameless libertine. Historians can talk about how he ended the papal crisis, or how he strengthened imperial authority during chaos. But what makes Sigismund stand out is how human he seemed. He wasn't a cold icon like Philip IV, nor a tyrant like Peter the Cruel. Sigismund was remembered as a man of many sides, Talented, flawed, victorious, scandalous. He resembled more a wandering artist than a king locked in a palace. And that's exactly why posterity remembers him as both real and relatable, not as a marble statue. Interestingly, his indulgent affairs also left their mark. Some noble families in Europe trace their lineage back to his illegitimate children. In other words, Sigismund left his legacy not just on the throne, but in the bloodlines, a kind of genetic memory that lasted for centuries. If the previous kings made you think medieval courts were chaotic, just wait until Louis XV of France. Because Versailles under his reign wasn't just a dazzling palace, it was a luxury, love resort, where parties lasted until dawn and scandal became the official sport. Louis XV came to the throne in 1715 at just 5 years old, and he was called Le Bien-Aimé, the beloved child. Sounds sweet, doesn't it? But imagine growing up in Versailles, a place of mirrors, gardens, and hundreds of adoring eyes. No wonder that by adulthood, Louis turned into a man who believed love was a luxury he had the right to spend lavishly. At first, Louis was praised as handsome, charming, and seen as the golden hope of a new age. He married Marie Leszczyńska, a Polish princess, kind and devout. They had 10 children together. But irony struck. After a while, Louis found marriage boring. And so he began seeking excitement elsewhere, specifically in the arms of countless mistresses. The most famous of them all was Madame de Pompadour. She wasn't just his lover. She was his confidant, political advisor, and the woman who shaped French art. Under her influence, Versailles became the capital of Rococo. Sweet paintings, lavish performances, and an atmosphere of romance hanging everywhere. People joked that without Pompadour, Versailles would have been nothing but a cold museum. But Louis XV didn't stop there. As he grew older, instead of calming down, he became more reckless. He created a secret house near Versailles called the past.So. Put simply, it was a mansion where he kept a rotation of young mistresses, often just 16 or 17, swapped out as if auditioning for roles in a film. This was when Louis's reputation began to collapse. What did the French people see when they looked at Versailles? Not power, but an endless party, while outside, the people starved. Rumours of the past.So spread across Paris, and Louis was no longer the beloved, but the hated king. The irony is, Louis XV wasn't an incapable ruler. On the battlefield, he had moments of brilliance, especially in the War of Austrian Succession. He was also a great patron of the arts, making France the cradle of Rococo and Enlightenment philosophy. But all of that was overshadowed by his reputation for debauchery. In his final years, Louis grew anxious about politics. He knew the people despised the court's extravagance, but he couldn't give up his habits. When smallpox struck him down in 1774, the people of Paris celebrated instead of mourning. Some even mocked. Louis died of smallpox, but really he was killed by his own pleasures. And Louis XV's legacy? You don't need dry lists to see it. Versailles in his time was the perfect mirror, breathtakingly gorgeous, yet rotten inside from endless feasts and the king's indulgence. Louis left France not just with masterpieces of Rococo, but with the image of a court severed from reality, far removed from its people. And that distance became the spark for the French Revolution just decades later. People no longer saw the beloved child, but only a king who turned Versailles into the symbol of decadence. Christian VII of Denmark is often summed up in one short phrase: a big child on the throne. Born in 1749, he took the crown in 1766, at just 17 years old. And from the very beginning, the court realized they had just crowned a king unlike any before. Christian wasn't exactly cruel. He was just unstable. Contemporaries described him as a boy trapped in a man's body, irritable, impulsive, and obsessed with odd amusements. During solemn ceremonies, instead of listening to his advisors, he would fiddle with his gloves, giggle, or snap his fingers to the music. Once, he even walked out of a royal festival just to play with dogs. His entertainments went far beyond the norm. He was obsessed with hurting himself. Witnesses said he often slapped his own face, pinched his skin, or staged fake fights with palace guards. He was also enthralled by prostitution, alcohol, and nightly entertainments rivaling the excess of Versailles. His queen, Caroline Matilda, sister of England's King George III, fell into tragedy. At first, she hoped she might steady Christian, but she soon realized her husband would never be a normal king. Christian spent more nights with prostitutes than in his queen's bed. Caroline was lonely, abandoned in a palace of rituals, and that's when the political and romantic drama began. At the center of it all was Johann Friedrich Struensee, a German doctor. He was invited to court to treat Christian's mental health, but soon became his closest advisor, and in practice, the real ruler. While Christian spiraled out of control, Struensee pushed through bold reforms, abolishing torture, easing censorship, modernizing administration. Suddenly, Denmark had a wave of enlightenment, but not from its king, from his doctor. And then came the scandal. Caroline and Struensee fell in love. While Christian wandered in madness, his wife and his doctor shared love, ideals, and even a bed. Whispers spread, courtiers gossiped, and soon all of Europe knew. The king was mad, the queen was unfaithful, and the doctor held the throne. It was the perfect script for a historical soap opera. Naturally, the conservatives at court couldn't allow it. In 1772, a coup struck. Struensee was arrested, convicted of treason, and executed in brutal fashion. First his hands cut off, then his head. Caroline was stripped of her title, exiled from Denmark, and died young. And Christian? He was left on the throne, but only as a puppet. Real power went to a regency council. In the years that followed, Christian sank further into decline. He was tormented by mental illness, plagued by paranoia, shouting fits, or sudden stupors. The people rarely saw their king, and when they did, they saw only a thin shadow with vacant eyes, more ghost than monarch. When he died in 1808, few shed tears. For many, he had died long before, lost to illness and to power seized by others. It's hard to find great victories or monuments tied to his name. Ironically, the brightest legacy of his reign came from his doctor. Struensee's reforms, though crushed after his death, planted seeds for a more modern Denmark, and the tragic romance of Caroline and Struensee became one of Europe's most famous tales, retold in books, plays, and even the film A Royal Affair, 2012. As for Christian, he became the symbol of another tragedy, the tragedy of a man born to be king, but never fit to rule. A life of 59 years, most of it spent in the shadows of madness and under the control of others. Ivan IV of Russia, better known as Ivan the Terrible. If Christian VII of Denmark was the big child trapped in mental illness, then Ivan was a full-blown storm, a ruler both genius and nightmare, who made all of Russia tremble through nearly half a century of reign. Born in 1530, Ivan's childhood could make any modern psychologist underline the words, severe trauma. His father died when Ivan was just 3. His mother was poisoned when he was 8. The result? Young Ivan grew up in the Kremlin like a feral child, despised and abused by the boyar nobles. People say that, in revenge, young Ivan would throw animals off palace towers, a chilling image, but one that shows the hatred and fear of his early years. At 16, Ivan crowned himself Tsar of all Russia. It was the first time a Russian ruler took the title of Tsar, meaning Caesar, to assert absolute power. And from that moment on, he turned Russia into a stage for both greatness and horror. In the early years, Ivan impressed. He reformed the state, issued new law codes, created Russia's first standing army, and expanded eastward. Kazan and Astrakhan, powerful Muslim strongholds, fell to him, making Russia a vast empire. The people hailed him as the hero who unified their land. But then tragedy struck with the death of Anastasia Romanovna, his first wife and only true love. Anastasia was the anchor who kept Ivan balanced. When she died in 1560, likely poisoned, Ivan unraveled. From a wise reformer, he became a paranoid tyrant, suspecting everyone, acting like a monster. Ivan created the Oprichnina, a secret police force dressed in black, riding black horses, spreading terror across the land. Their symbols were a broom to sweep away traitors, and a dog's head to tear them apart. Anyone suspected of treason, nobles, peasants, entire cities, could be tortured or executed without trial. Whole cities like Novgorod were massacred, tens of thousands slaughtered, simply because Ivan feared betrayal. His cruelty reached its peak in a family tragedy. In 1581, in a fit of rage, he struck his eldest son, Ivan Ivanovich, on the head with an iron staff. The prince died soon after. That blow wasn't just a personal loss. It was the death of the dynasty's future. The famous painting by Ilya Repin, Ivan the Terrible and his son, still chills viewers today. And yet, it's impossible to deny that Ivan also laid the foundations for a powerful Russia. Under his rule, Russia doubled in size, becoming a vast Eurasian empire. He also loved art and architecture. St. Basil's Cathedral in Red Square, with its colourful onion domes, is his lasting symbol. Russians see him through two lenses. On one hand, he was a bloodthirsty tyrant, a dictator who left a legacy of fear and absolute rule. On the other, he was the ruler who laid the first bricks for a mighty Russian empire. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Ivan was both genius and monster. He loved Russia, but that love was twisted into control by blood and iron. Even today, the name Ivan the Terrible sends shivers down spines, not only because of his cruelty, but because it reminds us that absolute power always comes with absolute danger. Rudolf II was not the kind of emperor you usually picture, not a mighty warrior, nor a cold-blooded politician. He was more like an eccentric scholar misplaced on the throne. Ruling from 1576 to 1612, Rudolf spent most of his time not on battlefields, but in secret chambers in Prague, surrounded by ancient books, alchemical drawings, and bizarre paintings. From childhood, Rudolf was different. Born into the Habsburgs, a dynasty famous for political ambition, he showed little interest in power. Instead of learning to command armies, he immersed himself in painting, astronomy, astrology, and mystical rituals. When he became Holy Roman Emperor, many expected him to continue the tradition of conquest. Instead, he turned the court into a giant magical laboratory. Prague under Rudolf looked like a Versailles of the eccentric. He invited painters, alchemists, astrologers, and even those branded as heretics. Figures like Tycho Brahe, Johannes Kepler, and Giuseppe Arcimboldo all appeared in his court. In fact, Kepler developed some of his greatest astronomical theories under Rudolf's patronage. But at the same time, the emperor was obsessed with the arcane. He collected fossils, strange animals, and even torture devices. His collection was considered one of the largest Wunderkammer, cabinets of curiosities, in Europe, where you could find anything from bizarre skulls to forbidden alchemical manuscripts. People said Rudolf believed he could discover the formula for eternal life, and many nights his laboratory lights burned until dawn. Of course, an emperor too busy with astrology and alchemy neglected politics. Rudolf all but abandoned ruling. When the Holy Roman Empire faced growing religious tensions between Catholics and Protestants, he offered no solutions. Instead, he hid in his chambers gazing at the stars. Many historians argue that his indifference helped push Europe toward the 30 Years' War. On top of that, Rudolf suffered from severe depression. He often sank into gloom, paranoia, convinced his servants plotted against him. One story says he once refused to leave his room for weeks, receiving food only through the door, while the empire outside slid into chaos. His private life was equally mysterious. He had numerous lovers, both men and women, but almost never publicly acknowledged them. Some say he was sexually obsessed to the point of sickness, others that he was too shy for lasting relationships. Either way, Rudolf left no legitimate heir, a mistake that handed the throne to other branches of the Habsburgs. And Rudolf II's legacy? Two images coexist. On one hand, he's remembered as a failed emperor who weakened the Habsburg Empire, deepened religious tensions, and sowed the seeds of Europe's bloodiest 17th century war. On the other hand, he left a dazzling cultural legacy. Under his reign, Prague became a great cultural centre where scientists and artists thrived. From Arcimboldo's surreal paintings to Kepler's planetary orbit theories, all bear the mark of an eccentric emperor who loved beauty and mystery. You could say Rudolf II didn't build his empire with swords, but with strange dreams and obsessions of his own. And that contrast between political failure and cultural brilliance makes him one of the most unique characters among Europe's bizarre monarchs. Mary I of England, better known by the infamous nickname Bloody Mary, was one of the most controversial queens in European history. The daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, Mary grew up in a family full of tragedy. Her father broke from the Roman Church to marry Anne Boleyn, her mother was cast aside, and Mary herself was branded illegitimate for years. Those childhood scars didn't just shape her personality, they turned her into a woman obsessed with religion and righteousness. When Mary took the throne in 1553, after the short reign of her brother Edward VI, England was deeply divided. The people had become used to Protestant reforms, but Mary, a devout Catholic, was determined to bring England back into the arms of the Pope, and that's when the nickname Bloody Mary was born. In just 5 years, Mary launched a brutal campaign against Protestants. Over 280 people were burned alive for heresy, including famous bishops like Hugh Latimer and Thomas Cranmer. The public executions at Smithfield became a terrifying symbol of Mary's rule. Where the screams in the flames echoed through London, people began whispering Bloody Mary, a name that has haunted her legacy ever since. But it wasn't just cruelty. Mary also made a major political mistake: her marriage to Philip II of Spain. When she announced she would wed the most powerful Catholic king in Europe, many in England saw it as betrayal. They feared England would become a province of the Habsburg Empire. Rebellions broke out, but Mary held firm, convinced this was the way to preserve Catholic faith in England. Her personal tragedies made the reign even darker. She longed for children to secure her dynasty, but twice her pregnancies turned out to be false. Her belly swelled, but no baby was born. It may have been a tumour or another illness. The crushing disappointment left Mary more desperate than ever, clinging to religion like a lifeline. To make things worse, her Spanish alliance dragged England into pointless wars. The biggest disaster was losing Calais, England's last foothold in France. When the news reached Mary, she supposedly cried out, "When I am dead, you will find Calais written on my heart." A bitter lament that showed she knew exactly what failure she was leaving behind. Mary died in 1558 at just 42, lonely and childless. Her successor was Elizabeth I, her half-sister, daughter of Anne Boleyn, who became her complete opposite. Elizabeth restored Protestantism and ushered in the Golden Age, while Mary was etched into history as a symbol of fire and blood. When people think of Mary, most only remember the flames, a queen haunted by vengeance and obsessed with restoring Catholicism. But to be fair, Mary wasn't simply a butcher. She was also a woman trapped by fear and scars from her past. She wanted to defend her mother's faith, to prove she wasn't illegitimate, and to assert a woman's right to rule England. Tragically, those desperate efforts stained her image forever in blood. Mary left behind no grand monuments, no heirs, no shining legacy. What she left was a grim lesson. When power collides with personal obsession, the result is a short reign and a very long shadow. Louis XI of France was often called by a nickname that sounded both frightening and bizarre: the Spider of France. He reigned from 1461 to 1483, and honestly, the image of a spider's web was the perfect metaphor. Louis wasn't the kind of king who rode into battle like a knight. He was the one spinning traps in the dark, patiently waiting for his prey to stumble in. Even as a prince, Louis was infamous for being cunning and independent. He hated the control of his father, King Charles VII, so much that he repeatedly rebelled against the crown. When he finally took the throne, Louis brought with him a completely different style of rule. He didn't believe in knightly honour, nor did he care for the pomp of royal ceremony. What he believed in was intrigue, spies, and money. Louis XI had a vast spy network stretching across France and even Europe. They said there was no conversation in a court, tavern, or merchant hall that didn't reach the king's ears. He recruited merchants, monks, even prostitutes as informants. That's why his enemies called him the Spider. Always hidden, but from that thin web he could bring down entire kingdoms. He also had a strange quirk. Louis dressed incredibly plainly, even sloppily, shocking people who expected a king to look regal. But that too was part of his disguise. Beneath the simple clothes was a master manipulator who didn't need golden robes to project power. In politics, Louis XI was patient and coldly clever. He strengthened central authority by eroding the power of feudal nobles. His greatest enemy was Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, one of the most powerful lords in Europe. While Charles flaunted military might, Louis relied on his web of alliances, bribes, and waiting for the right moment. The result? After Charles's death in 1477, Burgundy collapsed, and most of its territory fell into French hands. Louis was also pragmatic in foreign policy. He kept shrewd ties with the Pope, with England, and with the Holy Roman Empire. To many in power, Louis seemed untrustworthy, always ready to switch sides if it suited him. But that very flexibility helped keep France stable during a turbulent age. As for his private life, Louis XI wasn't known for mistresses or lavish parties. He spent much of his time in monasteries, praying, while also plotting politics. Instead of a glittering Versailles like his descendants, Louis preferred gloomy fortresses and rooms filled with papers, where he wrote letters, negotiated deals, and directed spies. That image made people both fearful and contemptuous, but no one dared underestimate him. He didn't leave behind legendary victories or magnificent palaces, but he left behind a France more unified and powerful than before. Louis XI's policy of centralizing power laid the groundwork for a modern monarchy, moving France away from feudal fragmentation. The common people remembered him as sly, ruthless, even stingy. But in political history, Louis XI is remembered as the man who pulled France together and pushed it toward becoming a great power. The nickname the Spider wasn't just an insult, it was recognition. He knew how to spin a web strong enough to catch all of Europe. The name of the king who made both Asia and Europe tremble, Tamerlane, or Timur the Lame. Born in 1,336 inches Transoxiana, today's Uzbekistan, Tamerlane didn't come from a glorious royal line, but from an ordinary nomadic noble family. Yet from those modest beginnings, he rose up and became one of history's most infamous conquerors, a man who spread terror from the Central Asian steppes through Persia, India, and all the way to the Mediterranean. Timur got the nickname the Lame after a wound in a youthful battle left him limping for life. But don't let that limp fool you. Behind those uneven steps was a ruthless strategic mind and an ambition with no limits. He saw himself as the heir of Genghis Khan and was determined to build an empire even more terrifying. His campaigns were infamous for their brutality. In 1387, when he took Isfahan, he ordered the execution of 70,000 people and built towers of skulls as a warning. In Delhi in 1398, his troops ravaged India's capital, killing hundreds of thousands and turning a flourishing city into a sea of fire. In Aleppo and Damascus, he did the same, leaving behind nightmares carved into the memory of the Islamic world. Timur didn't just want victory, he wanted fear itself to be his weapon. But behind the bloodlust, Timur was full of contradictions. While destroying cities, he also patronized art and architecture. His capital, Samarkand, became a dazzling center of culture, filled with blue-domed mosques, markets buzzing with goods from across Eurasia, and scholars under his patronage. A man who could order 100,000 deaths in the morning, then admire a Persian poem at night. That was Tamerlane. Militarily, he was a genius. He used encirclements, feints, and lightning-fast cavalry strikes to crush his enemies. His army was tightly organized, moved like the wind, and spread fear wherever it marched. His greatest triumph came at the Battle of Ankara in 1402, when he defeated Sultan Bayezid I of the Ottoman Empire and captured the Sultan alive, an event that shocked all of Europe. What's striking is how Timur always cloaked his violence in religion. He called himself the Sword of Allah, claiming he was chosen to punish the faithless. In reality, religion was just a cover for his insatiable thirst for power. Timur's life ended in 1405 as he prepared to invade China. Death came suddenly at Otrar, in modern Kazakhstan, leaving behind a vast but fragile empire. Soon after, the lands he had conquered began to break apart and crumble. He didn't leave a lasting empire like Genghis Khan, but he left behind something unforgettable: fear. Across civilizations, his name became tied to blood, skulls, and devastation. And yet, Samarkand still stands today as a testament to that strange contradiction. A centre of art built on a mountain of bones. The irony is, from Timur's blood-soaked legacy came the roots of something far more beautiful, the Mughal Empire in India. His distant descendant Babur founded the dynasty that gave the world the Taj Mahal and a golden age of art. In other words, from Timur's terror came seeds of beauty. Tamerlane was both demon and sower. He proved that power built with iron and blood can shake the world, but it never lasts. What remains is not an empire, but the haunting memory of destruction and the blue domes of Samarkand still shining in the sunlight. Richard III is one of the most controversial kings of England, and also the figure Shakespeare turned into a symbol of villainy. But behind the play is a real man, cunning, tragic, and treated unfairly by history. Richard was born in 1452, right in the middle of the Wars of the Roses, a bloody civil war between the houses of Lancaster and York. He was of the York side, the younger brother of King Edward IV. Unlike Shakespeare's image of a hunchbacked cripple, the real Richard only had a slight spinal curvature. But the picture of the twisted king stuck to his name for centuries. Richard's path to the throne was full of controversy. When Edward IV died in 1483, his son, Edward V, was only 12 years old. Richard was named regent, but just a few months later, Richard declared that Edward IV's marriage was illegitimate, making his children bastards, and crowned himself instead. Classic uncle to king. The biggest shadow hanging over him is the fate of the two princes in the tower, Edward V and his younger brother Richard. The boys vanished after Richard took the throne, and many believe he ordered their deaths to secure his power. No solid evidence exists, but the image of the king who murdered his nephews clung to him forever. On the throne, Richard III ruled for just over 2 years, but it was chaos. He faced constant uprisings, as many nobles refused to accept him. Richard tried to present himself as a fair king, introducing legal reforms to protect commoners and merchants. But those efforts were drowned out by sinister rumours. To many, Richard wasn't a reformer. He was a blood-stained usurper. His end came in 1485, at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Richard faced Henry Tudor, heir of the Lancasters. In the fight, Richard fought bravely, even leading a cavalry charge straight at Henry. But he was surrounded and struck down. His death ended the York line and opened the Tudor dynasty with Henry VII, father of Henry VIII. Richard's final image was a naked corpse, dragged through the streets, put on display for mockery. Henry Tudor seized the chance. He cemented Richard's image as a deformed monster who killed his nephews for power. And when Shakespeare wrote Richard III more than a century later, he turned him into the hunchbacked devil, one of history's most famous villains, haunting audiences for 400 years. In collective memory, Richard is the child killer, the usurper, the tyrant. But the truth may be more complex. Many modern historians argue Richard wasn't as deformed as Shakespeare painted him, and may not have been involved in the prince's deaths at all. In fact, his legal reforms and trade policies were progressive for their time. In 2012, Richard's remains were discovered beneath a parking lot in Leicester, sparking a fresh debate. What people realised was that, though smeared for centuries, Richard had been a brave warrior who died fighting on the battlefield rather than fleeing. That made him the last English king to die in combat. Perhaps Richard's true legacy lies not only in his actions, but in how history and literature treated him. He was both a real man and a legend shaped by Tudor propaganda, and it's that overlap between reality and myth that makes Richard III one of the most fascinating kings in our imagination. On the list of figures who made all of Europe shudder, Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess of Hungary, definitely ranks near the top. Born in 1560 into a powerful noble family, Elizabeth had it all: wealth, castles, and status. But instead of leaving behind a legacy as a gracious noblewoman, she became a blood-soaked legend, a woman rumoured to have killed hundreds of young girls to bathe in their blood and preserve eternal youth. Elizabeth married at just 15 to Ferenc Nadasdy, a Hungarian noble famous on the battlefield. While her husband was often away fighting the Ottoman Empire, Elizabeth managed their vast estates and the fortress of Chaktis. And it was there that the chilling stories began. According to rumours, Elizabeth was quick-tempered and cruel. At first, She punished servants harshly for mistakes, from beatings to starvation. But over time, her cruelty escalated into horrific torture. Stories say she drove needles under victims' nails, doused them with freezing water in winter until they froze, and even bit into their flesh like an animal. Then came the most infamous legend. Elizabeth believed that virgin blood could keep her youthful. So she abducted peasant girls, killed them, and bathed in their blood. The numbers are staggering. Over 600 victims. One witness even claimed Elizabeth kept a ledger listing the names of hundreds of slain girls. Yet historians still debate whether that's fact or part of a political smear campaign aimed at destroying a powerful noblewoman. What's certain is that there were deaths. The rumours grew so loud they couldn't be ignored. In 1610, King Matthias II of Hungary ordered an investigation. Officials arrived at Chakti's castle, and what they found horrified the kingdom. Bodies of young girls, some still alive but tortured and dying in the dungeons. With that, Elizabeth was immediately arrested. But because she was a powerful noble, Elizabeth was never put on public trial. Instead, her servants and accomplices were executed, while she herself was walled up in her castle. The windows of her chamber were bricked over, leaving only a small slit for food. 4 years later, in 1614, Elizabeth died in isolation, buried in the darkness of the very castle that had echoed with blood and screams. And here's what makes her story so gripping. It sits on the edge between truth and legend. No one denies she was cruel, but the number of 600 victims may have been exaggerated. Some historians argue Elizabeth was a victim of political conspiracy. King Matthias owed the Bathory family a massive debt, and condemning her was a convenient way to erase it and seize her wealth. Yet no matter the truth, the image of the Blood Countess is carved deep into popular culture. From novels and plays to horror films, Elizabeth became the prototype for countless female vampire characters, even a female version of Count Dracula. Today, Chaktis Castle still draws visitors, not for its architecture, but for the legend of blood and the ghosts of young girls said to haunt its stone walls. In the end, Elizabeth Bathory left behind no political or cultural legacy. But she did leave behind an obsession. She became a reminder that power and isolation can turn a person into a monster, or at least into a monster in the eyes of history. Among the most powerful women in European history, Catherine II of Russia, Catherine the Great, easily tops the list. She reigned from 1762 to 1796, nearly 35 years, and transformed Russia from a chaotic empire into one of Europe's leading powers. But Catherine isn't remembered only for politics or reforms. Her name is forever tied to love affairs and ambition that made her both admired and endlessly fascinating. Catherine wasn't Russian. Born in Stettin, now in Poland, to a German noble family, she came to Russia at 14 to marry Grand Duke Peter, the grandson of Peter the Great. The marriage quickly turned disastrous. Peter was weak, childish, and obsessed with toy soldiers more than ruling. Catherine, by contrast, was intelligent, shrewd, and ambitious. They lived under the same roof, but in truth, in two separate worlds. When Peter III became Tsar in 1762, his reign lasted only 6 months. Catherine, with the backing of the army and the nobility, staged a coup. Peter was arrested and died in prison, a mysterious death many believe Catherine had a hand in. And from that moment on, Catherine became Empress of Russia. On the throne, Catherine showed rare brilliance. She loved Enlightenment philosophy, corresponded with Voltaire and Diderot, and turned Russia into a dazzling cultural hub. She massively expanded her empire, annexing Crimea, pushing deep into Poland, and making Russia a dominant European power. It's no accident that history calls her the Great. But alongside politics, Catherine was equally famous for her private life. She had a long list of lovers, nobles, officers, even young men brought into the court to serve the Empress. Her most famous lover was Grigory Potemkin, a brilliant general and soulmate. He wasn't just her partner in bed, but also her partner in politics, playing a huge role in Russia's territorial expansion. Some even believe Catherine and Potemkin secretly married. After Potemkin, Catherine continued to take younger lovers, and that became fertile ground for countless tales, from romantic stories to scandalous rumours. The darkest legend, of course, is the claim that Catherine died while having sex with a horse. Purely invented, a smear spread by political enemies. But it shows one thing. Catherine's love life fascinated people so much that they were willing to spin the wildest stories about her. Beyond scandal, Catherine was truly a great ruler. She reformed administration, modernized the army, encouraged science and the arts. Under her, the Winter Palace and the Hermitage became Europe's cultural treasures. To rivals, she was a female tyrant, but to intellectuals, she was a goddess of the Enlightenment. Catherine's death in 1796 closed out a golden era. She died on the throne, leaving behind a Russia larger, stronger, and a legacy both glorious and scandalous. There's no denying it. She was one of the greatest rulers in Russian history. She expanded the empire, made Russia a powerhouse, and left her mark on culture. But at the same time, Catherine is remembered for her love life, her name forever tied to endless curiosity. Her legacy is both bright and dark. On one hand, the empress who raised Russia to greatness. On the other, a woman whose image was warped by legend and gender bias. Perhaps the truth lies in between. Catherine was both a remarkable politician and a deeply passionate human being, with desires and flaws that were all too real. Charles XII of Sweden, also known as the Warrior King of the North, was one of the most extraordinary monarchs of the early modern era. He took the throne in 1697 at just 15 years old, and instead of spending his youth at banquets and balls, Charles chose a different path, the path of war. His contemporaries described him as a man born to wear armor, a king who saw the battlefield as his true home. The moment he sat on the throne, Charles XII was tested. Russia, Poland, and Denmark joined forces in what became known as the Great Northern Alliance, hoping to crush Sweden, a military power now led by a boy king. They thought Charles would be an easy target. They were wrong. In the early years, Charles XII proved himself a military genius. He defeated Denmark in just a few months, then crushed the Russian army at Narva in 1700. With far fewer troops, Charles led his men into a snowstorm, using speed and discipline to smash an enemy several times larger. This victory stunned Europe and turned Charles into a living legend. But instead of using his victories to secure peace, Charles pressed on with war. He invaded Poland, forced the Polish king to abdicate, and dragged the conflict on for years. Charles wasn't just a king, he was a warrior through and through, living in tents, eating like his soldiers, sleeping in armor, and constantly riding on the front lines. He never married, never had children. The battlefield was his only love. And yet, that same stubbornness led to disaster. In 1708, Charles XII set his sights on his greatest enemy, Russia. He marched deep into Russian territory, hoping to repeat the miracle of Narva. But the Russian winter was like no enemy he had ever faced. Freezing cold, famine, and scorched earth tactics left his army in ruins. And at Poltava in 1709, Charles XII suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of Peter the Great's forces. From that moment, Sweden's empire began its long decline. Still, Charles did not give up. He fled to the Ottoman Empire, where he stayed for 5 years, trying to convince the Sultan to wage war against Russia. Eventually, he returned to Sweden and went right back to fighting. That's right. Despite defeat, Charles didn't know the meaning of rest. He lived and died as a warrior. In 1718, during the siege of Fredriksten fortress in Norway, Charles XII was shot through the head while inspecting the trenches. To this day, no one knows for sure if the bullet came from the enemy or from his own men. Either way, his death ended a fiery reign and closed the book on Sweden's dream of dominating Northern Europe. He left behind a nation drained after decades of endless war. Sweden would never regain the great power status it had under him. For many historians, Charles XII was reckless, a man who let his pride drag an entire country into ruin. But for others, he was the embodiment of the warrior spirit, fierce, unyielding, and fearless even when outnumbered. Charles lived like a legend and died like a legend, on the battlefield, not in a palace, not on a throne, but in the mud and roar of gunfire. And perhaps that's why he remains so fascinating today. A king who didn't care for feasts or lovers, who never built glittering palaces, but who lived only to fight. A man remembered not for what he built, but for how he fought and how he fell. Charles II of Spain, better known as the Cursed King, was living proof of the tragic consequences of Habsburg inbreeding. He ruled from 1665 to 1700, and throughout his life, Charles carried not only the burden of a crumbling empire, but also the torment of a body twisted by generations of intermarriage. From birth, Charles looked sickly. He was described as having a long, drooping face with an enormous protruding jaw, the infamous Habsburg jaw, so severe he couldn't even chew food properly. He was frail, slow to develop, didn't walk until he was 8, and didn't speak clearly until his teenage years. Courtiers whispered that the young prince was not a normal child, and in many eyes, he really did seem more like a curse than a future king. When Charles took the throne in 1665 at just 4 years old, the country was essentially ruled by his mother, Regent Mariana of Austria. Meanwhile, little Charles remained confined to the palace, growing weaker with age. Throughout his life, he suffered from epilepsy, digestive disorders, impotence, and unstable moods. Doctors tried every bizarre remedy they could think of: exorcisms, strange potions, even smearing him with animal dung. None of it worked. Charles II's troubles weren't just physical. His contemporaries described him as a grown child, quick-tempered, superstitious, and utterly dependent on priests and fortune-tellers. The court became a theatre of spells, rituals, and prophecies. Some even believed he was possessed by demons, and after his death, physicians reportedly opened his coffin and declared his body was full of worms. Believe it or not, his reputation was forever tied to the supernatural. Politically, Charles II inherited what was once Europe's greatest empire, but by then, it was collapsing. The economy was in ruins, endless wars drained the treasury, and the bureaucracy was bloated beyond repair. Instead of reforming, Charles spent most of his time in religious rituals, praying for miracles, while nobles, priests, and foreign powers pulled the strings. His greatest tragedy was succession. Charles married twice, first to Marie-Louise of Orleans, then to Mariana of Neuburg, but fathered no children. His frail, diseased body simply couldn't produce an heir. All of Europe waited for him to die, knowing his death would decide the fate of Spain's vast empire. In 1700, Charles died at age 39, leaving behind a shocking will. He handed the entire Spanish crown to Philip of Anjou, grandson of France's Louis XIV. That move united Spain and France into a powerful alliance that terrified Europe. The result? The War of Spanish Succession, 1701-1714, one of the largest conflicts of the 18th century. He left behind no victories, no reforms, no heirs. But his personal weakness triggered a new chapter in European history, the end of the Habsburg line in Spain and the beginning of the Bourbon dynasty. People remember Charles II as the Cursed King, but also as a victim of fate, born into a dying dynasty, carrying the weight of centuries of inbreeding. He didn't choose that path, but his broken body became the symbol of an empire's collapse. In other words, Charles II didn't rule history. History ruled him, and that may be his true legacy. A reminder that even the mightiest dynasties, if rotting from within, can be brought down by a king too weak to stand. Marie Antoinette, the name instantly conjures up images of lavish gowns, glittering parties, and the sound of the guillotine blade falling in the middle of a revolution. Born in 1755, she was an Austrian princess, daughter of Empress Maria Theresa. At just 14, Marie was married off to France's Dauphin, Louis, later King Louis XVI, as part of a political alliance between two great powers. That marriage carried her from the elegance of Vienna to the splendor of Versailles, where her story of power, luxury, and ultimately tragedy began. From the very start, Marie Antoinette was never truly loved by the French. She was a foreigner, arriving at a time when France and Austria had long been rivals. Add to that her youthful, impulsive nature, and she was quickly branded as extravagant and wasteful. While the people starved under famine and financial crisis, she was seen spending fortunes on dresses, jewels, and all-night parties at Versailles. The public gave her a bitter nickname, Madame Difficile. Her marriage to Louis XVI was no better. Louis was awkward, uninterested in his wife, and it took years before the couple finally produced an heir. The delay fueled endless gossip, whispers that Marie had lovers, that her children weren't of Bourbon blood. Among the most persistent rumours was her supposed affair with Count Axel von Fersen, a Swedish nobleman. To this day it remains unproven, but it was enough to ignite hatred. The scandal reached its peak with the infamous diamond necklace affair. A group of con artists used her name to swindle an enormously expensive necklace. Though Marie was innocent, the public believed she was behind it, greedy and reckless. Her image as a pleasure-obsessed queen only grew worse, reinforced by the line she never actually said but could never escape. "If the people have no bread, let them eat cake." When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, Marie Antoinette became the #1 target of rage. To the people, she wasn't just queen, she was the symbol of royal decadence, indifference, and corruption. When the angry mob stormed Versailles in October of 1789, the royal family was dragged to Paris, where they lived as prisoners in the Tuileries Palace. But Marie didn't sit quietly. She plotted escapes, the most famous being the failed flight to Varennes in 1791. Disguised, the royal family tried to flee the country, only to be caught just miles from the border. The disaster destroyed what little trust remained. From that moment, Marie Antoinette was branded a traitor. In 1792, the monarchy collapsed. Louis XVI was executed in January 1793. Months later, Marie was put on trial by the Revolutionary Tribunal. Prosecutors didn't just accuse her of treason and conspiring with foreign enemies. They hurled the monstrous charge that she committed incest with her own son. She denied it passionately, but the damage was done. The people already saw her as a monster. On the 16th of October 1793, Marie Antoinette climbed the scaffold. She wore a plain white dress, the colour of mourning in France. Her head fell beneath the guillotine to the roar of liberty from the crowd. The woman who once lived in the glitter of Versailles had become a tragic icon, a queen stripped of everything in the storm of revolution. To her contemporaries, she was the embodiment of extravagance and indifference, a queen who cared more about gowns and banquets while her people starved. But modern historians see her differently, a victim of revolutionary propaganda. She was frivolous, yes, but not to the extreme painted by her enemies. The tales of cake, the diamond necklace, even the incest accusation were largely the products of public hatred. Marie Antoinette's legacy isn't found in monuments or policies, but in her image. Dazzling, naive, and cut down in blood, turned into the symbol of a collapsing age. She is proof that in a revolution, the real person matters less than the image they represent. The Wanli Emperor, born Zhu Yijun, was the 14th ruler of the Ming dynasty, reigning from 1572 to 1620. He took the throne at just 9 years old, with the court hoping this young emperor would bring prosperity back to China. But instead of being remembered as a wise monarch, Wanli has gone down in history as one of the laziest and most self-indulgent emperors in China's past. In the early years of his reign, power was held by his regent, Zhang Zhuzheng, a brilliant statesman who reformed the finances, boosted revenue, and stabilized the empire. But when Zhang died in 1582, the emperor's true character began to show. He had no interest in governance and sank into a life of pleasure. It's said that for nearly 20 years, Wanli rarely attended a single court session. Officials sent memorials, but no responses ever came back. Meanwhile, the vast empire slid into decline as its ruler locked himself away in the palace. That palace became a world of luxury. Wanli had hundreds of concubines, but he showed special favour to one, consort Zheng. His obsession with her shook the court because he stubbornly insisted on making her son the crown prince, defying the established rules of succession. This Wanli succession dispute dragged on for nearly 15 years, splitting the court into warring factions. Beyond women, Wanli was also obsessed with wealth. He hoarded gold, jade, and treasure, piling them high in his storerooms. To feed his extravagance, he squeezed the people with heavy taxes, leaving peasants in misery. And as always, greed and neglect bred resentment among the masses. Still, Wanli's reign wasn't entirely empty. Under his rule, Ming forces intervened in Korea, helping the Joseon dynasty resist Japan in the Imjin War, 1592–1598. It was one of the biggest conflicts in East Asia during the 16th century, featuring the legendary Admiral Yi Sun-sin. But even that victory couldn't hide the truth. The Ming treasury was drained dry, while the emperor continued to drown in indulgence. Wanli died in 1620, after almost 48 years on the throne, one of the longest reigns in Ming history. Yet instead of glory, he left behind a broken empire. Finances collapsed, corruption rampant, and the people bitterly disillusioned. Within just a few decades, the Ming dynasty fell, replaced by the Qing. Many historians see Wanli's laziness and greed as a key factor in that downfall. He left behind no great works, no lasting reforms. What people remember most is his absence, an emperor who abandoned his duty, obsessed only with women and treasure. And in that void we find the lesson, that even a mighty empire like the Ming could crumble simply because its ruler sat idle while the state rotted away. The Wanli emperor became the symbol of decline, where the throne was no longer a burden to bear, but a chair to lounge in. And from there, the Ming slipped onto a path with no return. Picture Europe in the early 12th century. The Holy Land of Jerusalem had just fallen into the hands of European crusaders after the First Crusade, 1096–1099. In the spirit of victory, Christians from across Europe began pouring eastward, merchants, pilgrims, and seekers of glory. The road to Jerusalem became a never-ending stream of hope and faith. But alongside that, danger lurked everywhere. Arab raiders, resentful locals, and ambushes along dusty trails. It was in this atmosphere that a unique idea emerged. There needed to be a force that was both warrior and monk, dedicated to protecting pilgrims. And around the year 1119, in Jerusalem, a small band of knights led by Hugues de Payens, a nobleman from Champagne, France, created just that. At first, there were only 9 of them, far too few to be called an army. But from that humble number, one of the most powerful secretive orders of the Middle Ages was born, the Knights Templar. Their name came from their headquarters. King Baldwin II of Jerusalem gave them quarters in part of his palace on the Temple Mount, the legendary site of Solomon's Temple. From this they were called Pauperes Commilitones, Christi Templice Salomonici, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, or simply the Templars. What made them unique was an unprecedented fusion. They were monks under vows of poverty, obedience, and chastity, yet also knights with swords ready to spill enemy blood. In an age when monasteries and battlefields were separate worlds, the Templars erased that line. They prayed in the morning and fought in the afternoon. In their early years, the Knights Templar attracted little attention. They were a small, poor group, surviving on charity. But everything changed in 1129, when the Council of Troyes in France officially recognized the Templars as a religious military order under the direct protection of the Pope. That was the turning point. From a tiny band, they became the armed hand of the Church. They were exempt from taxes, free from the authority of local kings and lords, answering only to the Pope himself. With this sacred shield of protection, the Templars began to grow. Knights from across Europe flocked to join. Nobles donated land. Merchants entrusted them with wealth. Everyone believed that by supporting the Templars, they were helping safeguard the Holy Land and earning eternal rewards in heaven. Their symbol, a pure white mantle marked with a blood-red cross, quickly became an image that inspired both awe and dread. To Christians, they were God's warriors. To their Muslim foes, that red cross was a warning of death to come. The birth of the Knights Templar was not only a religious milestone, but also a political one. It reflected the Church's ambition to strengthen its power in the Holy Land, while answering a desperate need among Christians to make pilgrimages under protection. The Templars were the perfect solution to both. From 9 men at the start, within just a few decades, they rose into an elite force, respected across Europe. But from that moment on, their story went far beyond swords on the battlefield. It became a story of power, of money, and of mysteries that still fascinate the world to this day. If the birth of the Knights Templar was just a handful of poor knights with a vow to protect pilgrims, then to turn them from an obscure band into a powerful religious military force across Europe, they needed someone to vouch for them. and that someone was Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential religious figures of the 12th century. Born in 1090 inches, France, Bernard was a Cistercian monk renowned for his ascetic lifestyle and fiery eloquence. To many, he wasn't just a theologian, but the mouthpiece of God. Bernard had the power to move crowds with his words, to open the purses of nobles, and to make popes listen. And it was his backing that transformed the Knights Templar from a tiny fraternity into a continent-wide movement. In 1129, at the Council of Troyes, Bernard stood to defend and present the Templars before the church. At that time, many bishops were skeptical. How could a group of knights who wielded swords and prayed at the same time fit into Christian teaching? Wasn't killing contrary to the faith itself? Bernard, with his gift of persuasion, flipped that argument on its head. In his famous work, De Laude Novae Militiae, in praise of the new knighthood, Bernard made a bold claim. The Templars were not murderers, but milites Christi, soldiers of Christ. They did not kill men, they killed sin. They did not fight for earthly glory, but for the salvation of souls. To Bernard, the Templar's sword was an instrument of divine justice. This defense changed everything. Instead of suspicion, the Knights Templar were embraced as a holy army, officially backed by the church. And from there, the doors swung open. Nobles donated lands, merchants entrusted them with wealth, and young men of noble birth across Europe lined up to join. A group that once numbered just 9 knights now had the foundation to grow into a transnational force. Beyond theology, Bernard also helped craft the Templars' public image. He emphasized the contrast. While most knights indulged in luxury, the Templars lived austerely, sleeping on the floor, eating plain meals, wearing simple white mantles. Yet on the battlefield, they became a storm of red and white, charging into death without fear. Bernard's praise gave the Templars a sacred aura. To join the order wasn't just to become a knight, it was the shortest path to heaven. And in an age where faith guided every action, that promise was more powerful than any recruitment speech. You could say that if Hugues de Payens was the father of the Knights Templar, then Bernard of Clairvaux was their spiritual architect. He turned rough warriors into a living legend, bearing both sword and cross. But Bernard's influence didn't stop there. He also played a key role in launching the Second Crusade, 1147-1149. With his eloquence he stirred thousands, from kings to peasants, to take up the cross. And in that crusade, the Templars were no longer just guardians of pilgrims. They became the spearhead of Christendom's army. The bond between Bernard and the Templars created a lasting legacy. It legitimized, theologized, and mythologized the Knights Templar. Without Bernard, they might have remained just a small escort troop. But with him, they rose into the ranks of the most powerful forces of medieval Europe. If Bernard of Clairvaux gave the Knights Templar their sacred aura, it was discipline forged in steel that turned them from scattered warriors into the most feared war machine of the Middle Ages. In an age when many European knights were loyal only to their purses, flaunted glittering armour, and preferred feasting in castles over fighting on the battlefield, the Templars chose the opposite path: austerity, absolute obedience, and discipline so cold it was frightening. In 1129, along with official recognition from the Church, the Knights Templar were also given a code known as the Latin Rule. This code contained more than 70 clauses, later expanded to over 600, regulating everything from prayer and meals to how to ride horses and wield weapons. A Templar knight, upon joining the order, had to swear the 3 great vows: chastity, poverty, and obedience. That meant no marriage, no private property, and absolute submission to superiors. While feudal knights showed off prized war horses and gold-trimmed armour, the Templars were banned from luxury. Their mantle came in only 2 colours: pure white, marked with a crimson cross, the symbol of blood offered to Christ. Their meals were austere to the extreme. They fasted on many days of the week, were not allowed to eat alone, and every table had to have someone reading scripture. Wine was restricted, and diversions like hunting, gambling, or secular music were strictly forbidden. For them, daily life was a fusion of monastery and barracks. On the battlefield, Templar discipline set them apart from every other force. The rules stated clearly: they were not to retreat. A Templar could only withdraw if the enemy outnumbered them 5-1. As long as the banner and commander stood, They had to fight to the end. That's why enemies called them the Holy Lions. Once face to face, they charged like a storm, knowing no fear. Each knight was permitted 3 horses and 1 squire. This kept them ready for long campaigns and reflected their strict organization. No one could exceed the rule, no matter how rich or noble their birth. Within the Templars, a duke's son had to live like a peasant knighted on the field, no distinctions allowed. What shocked many was their severity in punishment. A knight who broke the rules, even for something minor like overeating or speaking crudely, could face harsh penalties. Fasting, losing his white mantle, or even expulsion. For a Templar, losing the white mantle was like losing the soul. It was a shame that could never be washed away. Thanks to this iron discipline, the Templars became one of the few forces kings could actually rely on. While feudal armies often disbanded once the money ran out, the Templars fought like God's army, not for profit, but for faith. And because of that discipline, the Templar image spread across Europe. They weren't just knights who could fight. They were symbols of austerity and absolute loyalty. People believed joining the Templars meant casting off all worldly temptations to live in purity, and if they fell in battle, they were guaranteed a place in heaven. Yet that same iron discipline also created a darker side. Many saw the Templars as soulless war machines, merciless and unyielding. To Muslim foes, they were little more than fanatics, ready to slaughter to the last drop of blood. And to some feudal knights, the Templars were intolerable. They didn't feast, didn't drink, didn't joke, only fought and prayed. When people think of the Knights Templar, the image that comes to mind is usually warriors in white mantles with red crosses, charging into battle on horseback. But there was another side to them, far less glamorous, yet it made them even more powerful, their mastery of money. In fact, the Templars weren't just warriors of Christ, they also earned a nickname that was both respectful and mocking: God's bankers. It all started very simply. Pilgrims heading to the Holy Land often carried money and valuables to pay for their journey. But the road to Jerusalem was full of danger: bandits, assassins, and opportunists ready to get rich off blood. The Templars quickly realized that protecting lives wasn't enough. They needed to protect wealth too. And so, a groundbreaking idea was born: an international deposit system. The principle was straightforward. A pilgrim in Paris could deposit money at a Templar chapel, receive a special certificate, and upon arriving in Jerusalem, present that slip to withdraw the equivalent amount. Safe, convenient, and almost impossible to rob along the way. Sound familiar? That's because it was essentially the earliest version of modern banking. The Templars didn't just hold deposits, they also lent money. Kings, nobles, great merchants, all of them needed cash for wars or trade, and they turned to the Templars. Backed by their religious reputation, exempt from taxes, and protected by the Pope himself, the Templars had advantages no other financial institution could match. They could transfer money quickly from England to Italy, from France to the Holy Land, in a world where most transactions still relied on wagons and coin purses. Wealth poured in, lands donated, castles, farms, endless amounts of coin and treasure. Across Europe, the Templars established commanderies, part monastery, part granary, part treasury. Every acre of land, every line of tax revenue fed into a financial web stretching from England and France to Italy and all the way to the Middle East. One clear sign of their financial clout was their relationship with kings. Henry II of England deposited his wealth with the Templars. The kings of Aragon, Castile, and even German lords trusted them as the most reliable bank in Europe. At one point, the entire treasury of the French crown was kept in the Templar headquarters in Paris. With all this wealth, the Templars became more than warriors. They were skilled administrators, professional financiers. Even the Italian merchants, famous for their financial savvy, respected their bookkeeping and strict rules. Many historians even credit the Templars with inventing the check, since their deposit certificates worked almost exactly like modern banking drafts. But wealth didn't just bring power, it also sowed suspicion. Ordinary people, who already saw the Templars with a mix of awe and unease, began to whisper, how could poor knights own land across all of Europe? How could men sworn to poverty become the creditors of kings? In the eyes of many, the Templars had turned into a kind of parallel power alongside monarchies. They had the sword, the money, and the Pope's protection. And when a religious military order held too much gold, too many royal debts, they didn't need to fear Muslim enemies. Christian kings themselves began to tremble. In the history of the Holy Land, no name inspired both respect and hatred from the Knights Templar quite like Saladin, the Muslim general and king who defeated the Crusaders and reclaimed Jerusalem. If the Knights Templar were the sword of Christ, then Saladin was the blade of Islam, and their clashes wrote some of the most epic and tragic chapters of the Middle Ages. Saladin, Salah ad-Din, emerged in the mid-12th century, at a time when the Muslim world was fragmented. Through military genius and diplomacy, he united Egypt and Syria, then turned his spear toward a common enemy, the Crusaders. And standing directly in his way were the Templars, in their white mantles marked with the Red Cross. From the very beginning, the struggle was bloody. In 1177, at the Battle of Mongisard, with only around 500 knights, many of them Templars, the Christian army shocked the world by defeating Saladin's force of over 20,000 men. It was one of their most glorious victories, and the Templars were praised as those who charged headlong into death, holding the line even when hopelessly outnumbered. But Saladin was not a man easily defeated. He patiently rebuilt his strength, cut supply lines, and took fortress after fortress. The climax came in 1187 at the Battle of Hattin, the Templars' day of reckoning. The Crusader army, led by King Guy de Lusignan and the Templar Grand Master Gérard de Ridefort, was lured into dry, waterless terrain. Under a blazing sun, they withered, while Saladin's forces tightened the noose. When the Templars launched their final desperate charge, they were annihilated in fire and steel. After Hattin, hundreds of Templars were captured. Saladin was renowned for showing mercy to ordinary prisoners, but when it came to Templars and Hospitallers, the fanatical holy warriors, he showed none. Most were executed on the spot. Chroniclers describe the white mantles drenched in blood, strewn across the burning sand, the greatest blow ever struck against the reputation of the Templar Order. This defeat opened the road to Jerusalem. In 1187, the Holy City fell back into Muslim hands after nearly a century under the Crusaders. For Christian Europe, it was a devastating shock. And that moment lit the fire for the Third Crusade, drawing in legends like Richard I of England, Richard the Lionheart. In that new campaign, the Templars once again fought on the front lines. They joined in major battles like Acre and Arsuf, standing shoulder to shoulder with Richard against Saladin. And though rivers of blood were spilled, neither side claimed total victory. In the end, a treaty was signed. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control, but Christian pilgrims were guaranteed safe passage. A paradox, since safeguarding pilgrims was the very reason the Templars had been founded in the first place. After the Battle of Hattin and the loss of Jerusalem to Saladin in 1187, the Knights Templar did not disappear, but the wound never healed. They were born to protect the Holy Land, and pilgrims travelling to Jerusalem, but when Jerusalem itself no longer belonged to Christianity, the haunting question echoed: what purpose did the Templars serve now? From the end of the 12th century, mighty fortresses became the Templars' lifeline. They built and controlled a chain of strongholds along the Levantine coast, the most famous being Acre, the Crusader capital after Jerusalem was lost. Acre was not only a military hub, but also a commercial crossroads, where gold and goods from Europe and the Middle East poured in. In their white mantles marked with red crosses, the Templars were both guardians of the walls and the police force managing trade, keeping the city alive for another 100 years. Their system of fortifications was nothing short of a medieval marvel. Crac des Chevaliers in Syria, Castellum Rouge in modern-day Turkey, massive limestone fortresses with walls meters thick and towers piercing the sky. These were the places the Templars fell back to as territory slipped away, turning their iron discipline into living stone. But no matter how strong, these castles were only small islands in an Islamic sea that kept growing stronger. By the 13th century, the balance of power had tilted decisively toward Islam. The Mamluk armies of Egypt, under leaders like Baybars, methodically recaptured stronghold after stronghold. In 1291, the final crushing blow fell. Acre collapsed. The Templars fought to the last man inside the city, but in the end, they were either slaughtered or forced to flee. The red cross on the white banner came down, marking the end of Christianity's presence in the Holy Land. The surviving knights retreated to Cyprus, then slowly scattered across Europe. From that point on, the Templars had no battlefield to prove their worth. They no longer had Jerusalem, no longer had Acre, and the remaining castles were little more than relics. What remained was the immense wealth they had accumulated over more than a century. But in this moment, that wealth became a burden. With no Holy Land left to defend, people began asking, why do the Templars still exist, still collect taxes, still hold lands and treasure across Europe? That unanswered question slowly turned into suspicion, envy, and hatred. After the fall of Acre, the Knights Templar entered their age of decline. They still had armies, they still had gold, but they had lost their original soul, the mission to protect Jerusalem. And when an organization is powerful, wealthy, yet no longer has a clear reason to exist, what lies ahead is not glory, but tragedy. After losing Jerusalem and Acre, the Knights Templar no longer had a battlefield to prove their mission. They withdrew to Europe, carrying with them the treasure, lands, and reputation they had built over more than a century. But while their military power weakened, their wealth swelled larger than ever, and it was that wealth that brought them head-to-head with one of the most powerful, greedy, and ruthless kings in Europe, Philip IV of France. Philip IV, also known as Philip the Fair, Le Bel, reigned from 1285 to 1314. Fair he may have been, but he was far more famous for his cold nature and hunger for money. The French crown at the time was drowning in debt from wars with England and Flanders. And who was the king's biggest creditor? None other than the Knights Templar. At first, the relationship between Philip and the Templars was close. They loaned him money, stored the royal treasury at the Templar headquarters in Paris, and were even considered as a core force if Philip launched a new crusade. But as his debts piled up, gratitude quickly turned into a simmering grudge. Philip began to see the Templars as a thorn in his side, a supranational organization, wealthier than many kingdoms, tax-exempt, and answerable only to the Pope. They had castles, lands, an army, and, most importantly, a vast treasure. To a king starved for cash like Philip, this was nothing less than a gold mine sitting inside his own realm. The excuse to strike came from public suspicion. Rumors swirled around the Templars, secret rituals, strange oaths, even whispers of worshipping skulls or denying the cross during initiation. Most of it was speculation or distortion, but in Philip's hands, those rumors became political weapons. He persuaded Pope Clement V, already under heavy pressure from the French crown, that the Templars were heretics and needed to be investigated. In truth, this wasn't a religious inquiry, it was a legalized asset seizure. Philip wanted money, and the Templars had money. That was it. But he knew that to legitimize his move, he had to cloak it in the sacred authority of the Church. So a personal grudge, mixed with greed, transformed into a continent-wide conspiracy. For years, Philip quietly gathered evidence, staged testimonies, and waited for the right moment to strike. To him, destroying the Templars wasn't just about settling debts. It was a way to prove that the power of the French crown stood above any other force, even the so-called warriors of Christ. And then, the fateful moment arrived. In 1307, Philip prepared a blow no one saw coming. He ordered the arrest of every Templar in France on the very same day. The plan was kept so secret that even many top officials had no idea until it happened. The feud between Philip IV and the Knights Templar, smouldering for years, was about to explode into a historical earthquake. And that earthquake struck on a date that still sends shivers through the Western world today. Friday, the 13th. On the morning of Friday, the 13th of October 1307, the sun rose just like any other day. But for the Knights Templar in France, it was the day their world collapsed. King Philip IV struck with a sudden blow. He ordered the arrest of every Templar on French soil, from Grand Master Jacques de Molay down to the anonymous knights in the commanderies. The order was kept secret until the very last moment. The night before, local officials across the kingdom received sealed envelopes from the king, each one containing the arrest order. They were instructed not to open them until Friday morning. And when the sun rose, a web of simultaneous arrests snapped into place. Knights were shaken awake, bound, and dragged from their fortresses and chapels, places that had once stood as symbols of their power. The official reason? Heresy. Philip IV accused the Templars of unspeakable crimes, denying the cross during initiation, kissing one another in shameful places as tests, worshipping skulls, worshipping the demon Baphomet, and committing mass acts of impurity. In a devout Christian society, these were horrifying charges, but in truth, most were fabrications meant to deceive the public. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master, was not spared. Just days earlier, he had attended the funeral of Philip's sister, even carrying her coffin, only to be betrayed and arrested. Trust and friendship turned to chains overnight. De Molay and many other Templar leaders were thrown into prisons in the heart of Paris, facing brutal interrogations. Philip's strike was not just political, it was psychological warfare. Arresting them all in a single day shocked all of Europe. The halo of the Templars, the warriors of Christ, instantly shattered, replaced by the image of chained prisoners like common criminals. Why Friday the 13th? For Philip, it was simply the day he chose for his plan. But in history, that date became a symbol of betrayal and misfortune. Western superstition later tied Friday the 13th to bad luck, and much of it traces back to the Templars' arrest in 1307. For many at the time, the shock wasn't just Philip's cruelty, it was also Pope Clement V's silence. In theory, the Templars answered only to the Pope. No one else had the authority to touch them. But under the heavy pressure of the French crown, and because Clement himself was already under Philip's influence, the Church did not immediately come to their defense. That silence struck just as deep as Philip's chains. In the days after Friday the 13th, rumours swept across Europe that Templars under torture confessed to heresy, that their massive treasure vanished from Paris before the soldiers stormed in. People whispered about wagons of gold rolling out into the night, a tale that fueled the legend of the Templar treasure, a mystery hunters still chase today. For Philip IV, the campaign was an early victory. He had toppled a power that rivaled the crown itself, right in the heart of France. But this was only the beginning. What awaited the Templars was not just prison, but torture, inquisitions, and sentences as brutal as the accusations themselves. After the mass raids of Friday the 13th in 1307, thousands of Knights Templar were locked away in dungeons across France, but the arrests were only the beginning. What Philip IV needed was confessions, and to get them, he did not hesitate to unleash the most brutal weapon of the Middle Ages: torture under the banner of the Inquisition. From the start, the Inquisition had been established by the Church to fight heresy in Europe, but in Philip's hands, it became a political tool. Knights who once thundered across battlefields, who once held their heads high before Muslim armies, were now stripped of their mantles, chained, and thrown into pits. From this moment, they were no longer warriors of Christ, but heretics in the eyes of the court. The methods of torture were cold and systematic: bodies stretched on the rack, water poured until men drowned, red-hot irons pressed to flesh, iron pliers crushing fingers to bone. Under such torment, many knights were forced to confess to things they had never done: that they denied the cross during initiation, that they kissed each other in shameful places, that they worshipped the demon Baphomet. These confessions were recorded, read before the public, and paraded as proof of the king's accusations. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master of the Order, was dragged before interrogators too. At first, he denied everything, but under overwhelming pressure, he was forced to sign a confession. It was a tragic moment. The highest leader, the man who carried the honor of the entire order, broken by ruthless tricks. Yet later, when brought out in public, de Molay retracted his words, declaring he had been coerced. That act transformed him into the final symbol of loyalty, though far too late to save his brothers. Everywhere, the same scene unfolded. Knights who once fought to the death on battlefields now died slowly in damp, stinking cells. Many did not survive the torture long enough to face trial. Others, shattered in body and spirit, were dragged before crowds to confess, then burned alive at the stake. This brutality split opinion across Europe. Some believed the charges, seeing the Templars as devils in monks' robes. But many others doubted. Could men who gave their lives for the cross really be heretics? The answer was never clear, the truth buried deep beneath the gears of torture. One thing was certain: Philip IV had won. He had his confessions, the paperwork he needed to legitimize the purge. Pope Clement V, under crushing pressure, was forced to open official trials, accept the evidence, and move step by step toward the final verdict. The glory days of Jerusalem, of Acre, of Montgassard, were nothing but fading echoes. In the darkness of the dungeon, the Knights Templar, a force that once struck terror into their enemies, were destroyed not by the sword, but by the fire of their fellow Christians. After the heresy trials, the forced confessions, and the bodies burning on the stake, what was bound to happen finally came. In 1312, at the Council of Vienne convened by Pope Clement V, the Knights Templar, the order that had once commanded the respect of all Europe, was officially dissolved. In the papal bull Vox in Excelso, the Pope did not outright declare the Templars heretics. He simply stated that, because of their sullied reputation, the rumours spreading, and the pressure from many kingdoms, especially France, the order was no longer fit to exist. In other words, this was a political sentence more than a religious one. The Pope was forced to bow to the pressure of Philip IV, the man who truly held the power. For a military monastic order with nearly 200 years of history, that decree was nothing less than a death blow. The lands, castles, and treasure the Templars had built over generations were seized. On paper, much of it was handed over to the Hospitallers, their rivals and fellow crusaders. But in reality, a great deal went straight into the hands of kings, especially Philip IV. As for the surviving knights, their fates varied depending on the land. In France, many remained imprisoned, some were executed, others managed to flee. In England and Portugal, the attitude was more lenient. Many Templars were transferred into other knightly orders or continued serving under new names. But wherever they were, the name Knights Templar disappeared from Europe's map of power. The image of that day was tragic. Warriors who once rode fearlessly through Jerusalem, who once stood as the Bank of God, were now reduced to a memory buried by political schemes. Their downfall did not come from defeat on the battlefield, but from the hands of power within Christendom itself. And yet, that very dissolution created a paradox. The more they were stamped out, the brighter their legend burned in the imagination of future generations. As their treasures vanished, as rumours claimed vast riches disappeared from Paris, as their secret rituals remained unexplained, the void quickly filled with myth. People began to ask, where did the Templar treasure go? Did they hide the Holy Grail, sacred relics, or forbidden knowledge? Did some knights escape, carrying with them secrets that birthed hidden societies? These questions, with no certain answer, kept the name of the Templars alive for centuries, in history books, in novels, in paintings, and on the silver screen. But going back to 1312, for those who lived it was nothing more than a death sentence. A force once powerful, wealthy, blessed by the Pope, and respected by all Europe, was erased in just a few short years, all because of the greed of one king and the weakness of one Pope. The 18th of March 1314, in Paris, along the banks of the Seine, a massive crowd gathered. People came to witness a spectacle that would pass into legend: the death of Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar. De Molay had been imprisoned for nearly 7 years after the roundup of 1307. During that time, he endured sham trials, brutal interrogations, and repeated forced confessions of heresy. At first, under torture, he signed. But in the end, when brought out in public to confirm his guilt, he boldly retracted it all. He declared the Templars innocent, and that he himself had confessed only under duress. That statement was like a dagger to the face of King Philip IV and Pope Clement V, the men who had conspired to destroy the order. De Molay was originally meant to serve life in prison, but his final act of defiance enraged Philip. The king immediately ordered him to die by the cruelest punishment, burned alive. That afternoon, Jacques de Molay and several Templar leaders were led to the stake set up on the Ile de la Cité, right in the heart of Paris. In front of the crowd, he held his head high, showing no fear. Witnesses said that as the flames rose, he shouted loud and clear, "We are not guilty of heresy. We are faithful to Christ. It is those who condemn us who are guilty." The scene stunned the crowd into silence. The fire consumed his body, but his words echoed through Paris. And legend says that before he died, Jacques de Molay cursed them. He summoned King Philip IV and Pope Clement V to appear before God's tribunal within the year. Strangely enough, within months, both men were dead. Clement V died in April 1314, just 1 month after de Molay. Philip IV followed in November that same year, after a sudden hunting accident. To contemporaries, this was undeniable proof that the Grand Master's curse had come true. From then on, the legend of the curse of Jacques de Molay spread across Europe, haunting generations to come. De Molay's death was not just the end of a man, but the end of an era. He was the final embodiment of the Templars, once feared and revered across Christendom, now struck down by the very allies they had served. And yet, his death ignited the myth. The Templars were no longer seen merely as a dissolved order, but as symbols of betrayal and injustice. Jacques de Molay, by his sacrifice on the flames, turned defeat into victory in the human imagination, the victory of honor over deceit, of loyalty over greed. From Paris, the tale spread across Europe. People whispered of the Templar treasure vanishing, of surviving knights forming secret societies, of sacred knowledge hidden under ashes. De Molay's curse became the seed of countless legends, from the downfall of the French royal line to ghostly Templars riding through the night. When the flames that consumed Jacques de Molay died out along the banks of the Seine in 1314, many thought the Knights Templar had vanished forever. But the truth was the opposite. That was the moment they began a new life, no longer with swords, but with legend. The tragic death of de Molay and his curse against King Philip IV and Pope Clement V became the spark that ignited Europe's imagination. When both powerful men died within a year, people believed God had vindicated the Templars. From then on, their story was no longer just history, but a treasury of legend passed down for generations. One of the greatest legends was the lost treasure of the Templars. Rumour said that, on the eve of their arrest on Friday the 13th, 1307, a secret convoy slipped out of their Paris headquarters by night, carrying gold, relics, even the fabled Holy Grail. That treasure vanished without a trace, spawning endless theories. Some claimed it was buried beneath Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. Others swore it lay hidden in Scottish castles, or deep under the crypts of Paris. It wasn't just treasure. Their secret rituals also fueled myth. The forced confessions, that they kissed skulls, worshipped Baphomet, denied the cross, were products of torture, but they planted seeds of suspicion in later minds. People began to imagine the Templars as keepers of forbidden knowledge, guardians of religious secrets the Church wanted buried. Those mysteries tied the Templars to later secret societies. Some theories claim surviving knights fled to Scotland, merged with the Freemasons, and carried ancient wisdom into a powerful new brotherhood. There's no hard proof, but the supposed link between Freemasons and Templars has fascinated people for centuries. Popular culture only made them immortal. From medieval poets and painters to modern novels, theatre, films, and video games, the Templars have been endlessly reborn. Works like Ivanhoe, The Three Musketeers, and more recently the Da Vinci Code and Assassin's Creed all drew inspiration from them. The irony is, though they were condemned as heretics, they became symbols of loyalty, courage, and mystery. In collective imagination, the Templars are both holy warriors and keepers of dangerous secrets. That contradiction, half light, half shadow, made their legend more compelling than any other order in history. More than that, the name Knights Templar became a spiritual brand. For centuries, groups have claimed to be their heirs, forming secret orders, using the Red Cross, and proclaiming loyalty to the ideals of the old knights. Real or fake, it proves one truth. The Templars never died in the human mind. In a way, it was their downfall that made them legendary. Had they survived as just another military financial order, the name Templar might have faded into dry history books. But because they were betrayed, destroyed, and marked forever by Jacques de Molay's fiery death, they were cloaked in mystery. That shroud hid the facts, but made the story eternal. Today, whenever we hear Friday the 13th, or whispers of lost treasure, or of powerful secret societies, the shadow of the Knights Templar returns. They are no longer knights charging across deserts, but an eternal symbol of power, mystery, and betrayal. The Knights Templar disappeared from the political map in 1312, when the Pope declared their dissolution. But if you think their power died with them, that would be a mistake. In truth, the Templars' influence reached far beyond anything they ever physically held. First, their role in shaping Europe's financial system can't be denied. Their deposit withdrawal network for pilgrims was essentially the first draft of modern banking. Familiar concepts today, like checks, credit, and international transfers, trace back to their methods. Italian merchants, who later built powerful banks in Florence and Venice, were following the model. In many ways, the Bank of God laid the foundation for Western finance. Second, they left a lasting mark on architecture and military design. Their fortresses still stand: Crac des Chevaliers in Syria, Tomar in Portugal, the Temple Church in London. These fortifications fused east and west. Thick European-style walls paired with Arab-inspired moats, gates, and towers. Many of those defensive principles later shaped castles and strongholds across Europe. Their third, and perhaps most enduring legacy, lies in culture and collective imagination. When an order is erased under mysterious circumstances, it leaves room for myth, and the Templars became one of the West's strongest legendary symbols. From Jacques de Molay's curse to the lost treasure, to their shadowy ties with the Freemasons, all fed the belief that they never truly disappeared. In literature, they appear in Walter Scott's Ivanhoe, in Dumas's The Three Musketeers, and in modern works like Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code. In video games, Assassin's Creed turned them into eternal foes of the Assassin Order, spinning an entire universe from their shadow. On screen, from Hollywood to Europe, the Templars are always portrayed as sacred yet menacing. And beyond imagination, their influence carried into religion and secret societies. Many later groups claimed to be spiritual heirs of the Templars, from Catholic knightly orders to Western occult fraternities. The supposed link between Templars and Freemasons, though unproven, continues to be repeated. That's the power of myth. Once rooted, it doesn't need evidence to survive. Even in everyday language, they left a trace. When someone mentions Friday the 13th, people still connect it back to the arrests of 1307. That day, born as a political purge, became a global symbol of bad luck. Most importantly, the Templars became a mirror for power and betrayal. They showed how a small group could rise to greatness through discipline and faith, but also how it could be destroyed in an instant by greed and politics. That lesson keeps their story alive in debates about power, justice, and belief. And ultimately, their greatest legacy is that they never really ended in human memory. Though dissolved in the 14th century, the name Knights Templar still lives, still echoes, still fuels novels, films, conspiracy theories, and even spiritual devotion. An institution can die on paper, but once it becomes legend, it lives forever. And that is the glorious, tragic, legendary story of the Knights Templar. From poor warriors protecting pilgrims, to the Bank of God, to betrayal and vanishing in flames, they left behind a legacy that still lives on in history and in human imagination. Leave me a comment and let me know. Which detail about the Knights Templar impressed you the most? Was it the lost treasure, Jacques de Molay's curse, or their iron discipline? I'm always excited to read your comments, and to know that we're sharing a passion for history together from all around the world. Thank you for joining me on this journey. I'll see you in the next episode of the series.